My name is Laura Lindenfeld, and I'm a professor at the University of Maine, and I direct a center called the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center. We're in Dundee, Scotland, and I came here to be part of a group called the Knowledge Network for Transformation, KNET. KNET is an organization that formed. It's a collaboration of people from across the globe who are working together to figure out how we can build greater capacity to address the kind of transformation that we need to create to become a more sustainable society. It was started by Johan Fazy, who is here in the University of Dundee in Scotland. And I met him at the Resilience Alliance in France last spring. And he invited me to become part of this consortium of people to think about how we can link the research that we're doing with practice to advance our ability to become a more sustainable society, given the type of transformation that we need to undertake as a society. I'm a social scientist, but I have a background in the humanities as well. So for me, thinking about the kind of transformation we need as a society, I naturally think about the way that we need to be able to structure our lives and our work and our rituals and culture differently so we can deal with the kinds of consequences that climate change and other environmental change are bringing to our society. We're not really set up to be able to deal with the magnitude of change that we're facing. So when I think about transformation, I think about how the different institutions in which we live and work, schools, industry, how do we need to change them to be able both to stop the problems that are causing climate change and to be able to address the changes that we may not be able to manage as well as we would have hoped any longer.
Okay.
The kinds of changes we need in the way we produce knowledge, I think they're quite significant. And from someone who studies, a lot of my work looks at universities and change and the way that we need to restructure higher education. There are some tremendous challenges, which also means there's great opportunities. Higher education is one of these institutions, especially I'll talk from a US context since that's where I live and work. They're very robust. They tend to stay around for a long time, universities. They're pillars within their communities, but that also means that they can become sedimented and less adaptive. Getting universities to change is, I think, a grand challenge, but being able to do that and rethink the way, not just how we communicate the research we produce, but how can we produce research that's more aligned with the needs that society has, is a challenge before us that higher ed needs to stand up and address. Much of my work focuses on how we can advance collaboration. And what I do is I research teams working at universities, and I try to understand through my research how those teams can work more effectively with people outside the university, stakeholders or communities. Higher education has this unique place in society in that it's one of the few places where you can think autonomously. You have some freedom to embrace ideas that may not be popular. I think there's a really important place for blue sky thinking. We need people doing bench science and really unique approaches that may not be relevant for hundreds of years. Universities should still keep doing that. My concern is that we need to turn more of our attention to contemporary needs as well. And we need to equip ourselves better, both as university researchers, to align what we're doing with societal need and to understand the needs of stakeholders. So my research looks at both sides of this. It's like a system. On the one hand, we have researchers who come to what they do because they're passionate about it, they care, they choose certain topics that they work on, but they may not know how to set their research up so that it can be more useful to people outside of the university. On the other hand, we have all this societal need, and I believe, and my work hopefully is contributing to this, that we should seek to understand what that need is with the different tools that we have as researchers. What do people want from research? How do they want it delivered to them? How do they want to communicate about it? My background is in communication, so I'm concerned with the ways that we set up bridges with each other, that we use language, and we understand that people construct their reality through language and use that language in very different ways to create their sense of being and doing in the world. I would categorize this kind of research as use-inspired basic research. We really want to contribute back to theory, to explaining how things work in the world, but at the same time make that work useful so that people can actually build on it rather than just talking back to other researchers, which is fine, but for me, no longer enough. And that's how I see the kind of change that universities need to take on. We need to take on that sense of responsibility that there's a world out there that could derive greater benefit from the thinking and theorizing and analysis that we do. One of the grand challenges within that is I'm not the only one to think about this, a lot of people are struggling with it, is to help us work across our different disciplines. It's like we have these silos that we're stuck in, these traps of language that we become entrenched in, that in many ways undermine our ability, even within universities, to make sense together of the problems in the world and how we could work together. And I see this as a system wherein teams of researchers must model the kind of collaboration that we would want to see in society if we are going to be able to advance our efficacy outside. We've actually done some research. This is one of the things I found most fascinating. My doctoral student, Bridie McGreevy, this was a part of her dissertation. And we learned that through a study of about 100 researchers on a large sustainability project, there were a bunch of sub-teams on this project, Maine Sustainability Solutions Initiative. It was funded by the National Science Foundation. And what we learned on this is that the sub-teams that utilized democratic decision-making processes and that enabled all team members, whether they were graduate students or undergraduates or faculty or research center directors, so thinking of it in terms of hierarchy, and academia is very hierarchical. The more democratic they were in their decision-making processes, the more likely the team was to be resilient and thrive. And even more, the more likely those teams were to persist in their interactions with stakeholders. So for me, I think we have to think about this as part of systems of communication where, to use a metaphor, if we can set up houses in which we want to live, we get to invent these houses, teams as living in a house, and we get to populate them with furniture and all the things we need to live our lives and create a culture of working together. The more effective we can be at doing that together, the more likely we are going to be to have success when we transcend the boundaries of the university. Let me give you an example of one piece of work that we did, and by work I mean research and implementation. I see these as coupled, where we were able to take the research that we did and wrap it back around into a strategy that's trying to advance a solution. We did a survey. I live in the state of Maine. It's in the far northeast of the United States. It's a cold rural state with about 1.2 million people. And we did a survey of the legislature in Maine, the House and the Senate. This was 2 years ago, so 2013. And we sought to understand, what do legislators as a group, as policymakers, what do they need from the university that they may not be getting? How much do they know about us? How much do they trust us? What do they trust us to do? So we did this study, and we determined that they actually know very, very little about what we do, and yet they're interested in trying to connect with us more. So we tried to understand, well, how would you want to connect with us? And their answer was, we want to meet with you, faculty, researchers, face-to-face, over coffee, in our state capital. This sounds really simple, but it's not. It's an hour-long ride from our campus, and people are uncomfortable. It's frightening for many researchers to talk to policymakers because they don't necessarily know what that world looks and feels like. So here's where the system piece came in. We stood back and we said, well, what would then enable people to feel more compelled to engage in this kind of interaction with policymakers? And we discovered that we could develop a program to train faculty. We could use, there's this wonderful training program at Stony Brook University called the Alan Alda School of Science Communication. And what they do, this is music to my ears as someone who originally comes from the humanities. They combine theater improv techniques with science communication. So they're bringing the best of these two worlds together. It's like a marriage of art and humanities and science. And I did this training, and I managed to bring them up, and I developed a cohort of 20 faculty from all disciplines across the campus, many of whom don't know each other, had never collaborated. And I thought, rather than starting with something like a grant proposal where everybody wants their piece of money, let's start with a group of people who care about serving the needs of our state and see how that grows. So it's been a year into this program, and what we're seeing is that this group of faculty, they're starting to collaborate more with each other. They're reaching out to policymakers. They're undertaking new forms of communication that would have been frightening to them. And we're seeing impacts in the real world as a result of their willingness to step up and reach out. It's incredibly inspiring to me. Wouldn't it be a wonderful world if we could help everybody to listen to each other better? Some of this is so simple. Getting people to actually hear and come to the table together, it's not always so easy, especially in the political domain. It's not just policy, it's also politics. There are ways in which we can help policymakers to understand the value that research can bring to them. My turf is on a university, so I have some purview over how we interact as faculty or researchers with each other. It's a little more challenging to tell policymakers that we're going to sit them down and train them. What we can do is we have relationships from the Policy Center that I direct with other organizations in the state, nonprofit, for example, called the Maine Development Foundation. And what we do is we organize bus tours for new policymakers, new legislators, so they can become exposed to different parts of the state they haven't seen before. We also work together with them to develop a Policy Leaders Academy. So we put a lot of thought into what kind of information can we deliver to them in a short amount of time, understanding that their culture is really different from our culture. My background actually is in cultural studies, so I tend to approach things from the lens of culture. What are the rules and practices and rituals that people engage in that constitute their sense of being in the world? And different things are important to different people depending on those cultures. So the fact that we have this boundary organization of Maine Development Foundation that can help us broker those relationships, I think is really critical. One of the things that shows up over and over and over again is that the greater trust that exists, the more likely people are to be willing to listen to and actually hear each other and then act on that information. I also think we should never underestimate the role of affect and feeling. People act because they care. If we can get legislators to care about research, genuinely care, and understand the role that it could play, that it could help them make much better decisions that would improve society, even if it might mean some short-term losses for them. They think on 2 or 4 year timeframes. That could be tremendous. So that aspect of building trust and relationships, I think, is essential to transformation. So in the last years, I've been involved in a number of large interdisciplinary projects. For example, a project that's looking at what happens when you get more than 2 inches of rainfall. Beaches and shellfish flats on our coast, which are a significant part of our state's economy, have to the shellfish flats have to shut down because bacteria enter into the water, which then enters into the clams and oysters and renders them potentially dangerous. So we've had a project focused on that. I have to tell you, what's most exciting to me about that, it's something I care about so passionately, is that it's about food and food sourcing. Out of that project grew for me the ability to become involved in a really large effort. I'm talking, this is a team of like 75 to 100 people to undertake a statewide research and engagement-based program called the CNET, Sustainable Ecological Aquaculture Network. And what it is it's a group of researchers partnered with NGOs, nonprofits, industry, to develop approaches to aquaculture that are sustainable for people and the planet, so that we can plan for the future of our state of Maine and use that as a model for other places to make sure that we can produce the food we need for the planet, but do it in such a way that it actually provides benefit back to the planet. That's an incredibly exciting project for me. So the CNET project for me is particularly exciting because it unites a number of things that I care about. It brings into play issues of how we can link science and research. When I say science, I mean science and social science, but more broadly, the work of the humanities as well, into decision-making about how we manage our coast. So we hope to help our research create the kinds of policies we need in our changing environment that can also support economic prosperity in our state. A lot of people in the state of Maine who live on the coast are dependent on the natural resources of that place. And their culture is deeply tied to that place. And that sense of place is something that we need to treat with deepest respect and reverence. So this group of researchers, and it's always fascinating to see how these groups, they call it storm, norm, perform, how they come together and manage to make sense of so many different areas of research and work together is always a challenge. For me, as one of the leaders on this project, I'm hoping to be able to contribute back from my own work on a number of different interdisciplinary sustainability projects so that we can become a well-oiled machine. For collaboration of this, for a project of this magnitude to succeed, we're talking about a $20 million investment from the U.S. National Science Foundation. That's a big responsibility. And what they're funding us to do is to do the research and help the research lead to action, so that we can see a thriving aquaculture industry along the coast of Maine that has all the policy and societal support that it needs to flourish, provide support for the economy, for the people, and the culture. For that to succeed, in my opinion, it requires a strong sense of collaboration and trust. So one of the things that we're doing in the early stages is seeking to understand how that team sees itself, sees each other, and how we can utilize people's understanding of how they want to communicate and work together, feed that information back to the team so the research is informing practice, and set up a more robust, sustainable infrastructure. At the end of the 5 years, we should be a thriving center and a model throughout the world of what it means to bring university research to the production of sustainable food. Food is this remarkable arena to study because it gives you insight into culture, values, attitudes, the environment, decision-making, governance. It's unbelievable, and I've been studying food for a long time. I'm especially thrilled that CNET is focused on food because it lets me build on a whole period of research in my past that is concerned with how we give power to people and how food enables or disables people to participate in society. I've often looked at groups who have been marginalized or disenfranchised and studied how they are represented in the media through the lens of food. And it's remarkable when you do that because what you see is food, this thing that seems so everyday and natural and normal, is this site that's just laden with so much power and politics. And when we begin to unpack that, I think we start to understand the deep entrenchment of ideologies that inform the practices of everyday life that that don't come to our awareness unless we call them to that level. For me, this links back directly to work in sustainability because I believe deeply that if we are to create a more sustainable society, that society has to be just and equitable so that we are not making choices about one place on the globe that they have good and healthy food and water and housing at the expense of another place on the globe. So food for me, you're going from this very small thing that hopefully is a symbol of enjoyment and identity and meaning, memory, to grander scales of politics and policy and global scale economics. It's just remarkable. And if you love food, like I do, even better. Let me give some examples of the type of research that I've done on food. One example is I did a study on food television, and I got asked to take a stand on, is food television a productive way of promoting healthier behavior in food choices? So it was about ethics of of using food television to influence people's choices. And what I found in this analysis that food television is really quite terrible. What it does is it promotes the consumption of unhealthy food. It encourages us to eat more and eat unhealthfully. So you're bombarded with advertisements at the same time as you're given the message that you should be thin and healthy and exercise more. Let me give you an example of work that I've done in communities to understand how we can create more sustainable food systems. Because for me, again, this really comes back to issues of justice and equity and empowerment. We did a study of restaurants in my city of Bangor, Maine, which is a small city. And we had noticed that the larger city in my state, Portland, Maine, has a very robust infrastructure for linking local fishermen and aquaculturists with restaurants. In my town, 2 hours north, you couldn't find a local oyster anywhere. If you were going to a restaurant, you would find fish that was from Southeast Asia. At the same time, we're producing all this seafood right on the coast that no one really valued or accessed. So this is one of my favorite research projects I've ever done. We interviewed restaurants and culinary schools to understand how we could create better linkages between the sourcing of food and food consumption. And the underlying belief was that restaurants are these really important purveyors of change, that if restaurants are sourcing more local seafood and talking about that and prioritizing it, it's going to influence how people make choices at home. A lot of people think about the social, ecological dimensions of sustainability, and I do too. They think about balancing our economic system, our social system, and the needs of the planet. What I'd love to see us think about more is culture and affect and feelings and the role of the arts. What I love so much about studying food is that it unites science and nature with what we love, what we care about, how we enjoy, how we celebrate. I think this is really critical because if people are going to be willing to transform how we make decisions, how we organize ourselves, how we live, they have to believe in that. And to believe in that, they have to care. And to me, it's the arts and humanities combined with brilliant science that are going to help us get to that much needed state. How do I see the future? I am an eternal optimist. I think we need more optimism. It would be very easy to drift into despair when we see some of the reports on sea level rise and ocean acidification, loss of habitat. I don't want to go there. I make a deliberate choice to think positively and productively and think about what is the piece that I can do in my little section of the world that can make a difference there and that can be a model for somewhere else. I love coming together with other people who are thinking about change and who are trying to function as agents of change. It's like 1 + 1 = 10 if you can do that, because we can energize ourselves and spread that incredible passion about creating a more just and vibrant future for all of us and the planet.